Welcome back to Praying with the Spanish Mystics. This is the second of three conferences. My name is Carl McColman, and this retreat is sponsored by Holy Cross Monastery. And let's begin with a prayer. And since our focus today is going to be on Saint Teresa of Ávila, of course, let me offer a prayer from her own words. May you be blessed forever, Lord. May all things praise you forever. And since I am not freed from such holy, heavenly madness coming from your goodness and mercy, for you grant this favor without any merits on my part at all, then, my King, I beseech you, either desire that all to whom I speak become mad from your love, or do not permit that I speak to anyone. Amen. So every time I pray that prayer, I wonder if I'm going to be struck dumb. It hasn't happened yet. So God is either very, very patient with me, or, which is probably true in any event, or hopefully this will be an opportunity for you and me, with Teresa as our guide, to taste a little bit of that holy madness that she speaks of. If you're new to Saint Teresa, you are in for a treat. She is one of the most colorful, most vivacious, most fascinating of the great saints and mystics, certainly in the Christian tradition, and I would argue in all of the world's great wisdom traditions. She is truly a character, and I hope that I can share a little bit of her personality with us today, and of course, focusing on her extraordinary teaching about prayer, about the life of the soul. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. So first, a thought for today coming from a 20th century theologian who I also think deserves to be called a mystic, and that's the German, I believe she was a Lutheran theologian, Dorothy Sohl. And she says, what eros is to sexuality, mysticism is to religion. What eros is to sexuality, mysticism is to religion. And the reason why I picked that quote to begin our time today is because Teresa, certainly how she has been represented in art, here of course is the sculpture of her from the famous sculpture from the Vatican by the Baroque artist Bernini. But in her writing as well, there many commentators have recognized that there is an erotic quality to her writing. Now, we use the word erotic in kind of the broadest sense. Teresa is not writing about sexuality per se, but she is writing about eros in the sense of, I guess, what you could call lust for life. This kind of deeply embodied, almost sensual recognition that we meet the presence of the Spirit of God in our bodies, in our lives, in the most humble and ordinary elements of our lives. And that the journey into the heart of God, and you will see the journey is very much a metaphor for Teresa. This journey is not a flight from our incarnation, from our embodiment, from our sensuality, but is rather a way of really recognizing that divine presence right here and right now. And so hopefully we'll get a taste of that as we get to know her a little bit better. So let's begin with just a little bit about the woman herself. Teresa is born in the spring of 1515. We celebrated her 500th birthday a few years back. And if you remember yesterday, we talked about St. Ignatius. She's about a generation after Ignatius. Teresa's in the middle of the three figures we're looking at today. John of the Cross is another generation after her. She dies in 1582. And there's an interesting little bit of trivia surrounding her death. If you know the calendar of saints, her feast day is actually October 15th. Now, normally a feast day is on the day that a person dies. Teresa happens to die on the feast day of St. Francis of Assisi. So October 4th was kind of already taken by an A-lister in terms of saints. And so I think what is maybe customary in whoever it is in the Vatican, I'm sure there's some little office in a corner somewhere, the person in charge of assigning feast days for saints. Normally you'd think they would just give her the very next day, October 5th, but they actually gave her the 15th. It's like, well, why is that? Well, because the year 1582 was actually the year in which the calendar shifted from the old Gregorian calendar to kind of the modern calendar. And for that shift, actually 8 days disappeared in the month of October. So Teresa actually dies on October 4th. The very next day was October 15th because of the shift in the calendar. And so that is the day that we now, to this day, is considered her feast day. It's a little bit of trivia there for you. She is canonized as a saint only 40 years after her death. And then she is named a Doctor of the Church in 1970. She is actually the first woman to receive that honor. In the Catholic and Orthodox world, there are a small number of theologians that are officially recognized as doctors of the church, as kind of embodying really the heart of theology, and that their writings and their teachings are considered exemplary not only for clergy and for theologians, but really for the entire people of God. It, like so many other things in the church, there has been the kind of the effects of sexism. There are actually 36 doctors of the church in the Catholic world. 32 of them are men, but 4 of the 36 have all been received that designation within the last 50 years. But Teresa was the first. So that, you could say long overdue, and that's, due to sexism, and I would acknowledge that. But she still received the honor and is kind of first among equals in that respect. She was a Carmelite nun. She entered the Carmelites as a young woman, and eventually was drawn to actually launch a reform for the Carmelites, which she, along with her mentor, or her protege, St. John of the Cross, who we will look at tomorrow, were the primary movers and shakers behind that reform of the Carmelite order. To this day, in the Carmelite world, you have the basic Carmelite order. Basic is probably not a good word, but just the Carmelite order, and then you have what's called the Discalced Carmelites. The Discalced Carmelites is the branch of the order that comes from the reform initiated by Teresa and by St. John of the Cross. She actually founded 14 monasteries and convents in her lifetime. So she was very dynamic, very active. She was comfortable speaking to people at all levels of society. She could talk to a bishop just as easily as she could talk to the gardener. And she was a voluminous letter writer. We'll talk about that in a minute. Very, very engaged kind of in this external life. But then in addition to all of that, she was a remarkable spiritual guide and spiritual teacher. Let me tell just a few stories right now to give you a sense of her personality. When you read her books, and we'll be looking especially at the interior castle over the course of today's conference, but when you read her books, you'll get almost a sense that there's kind of maybe a harshness or a sternness about her. And I think it really does reflect kind of the literary style of religious or spiritual writing in 16th century Spain. Remember, this is the age of the Spanish Inquisition. It's the age of the Reformation. There's a lot of anxiety, a theology that still places a great emphasis on the resisting evil, resisting the devil, on having to please a very patriarchal image of God. That's the world in which Teresa lives, and her writing very much reflects this. So I just want to share a few stories to give you a sense of the spirit of the person that maybe is a little bit different from how she appears in the printed words on the page. The first story I want to tell is a story involving a partridge. And to appreciate this, you have to understand that Teresa had a reputation that developed, especially as she got older, as a very pious woman and a woman of prayer. And the story goes, and I've seen several different versions of the story, so I'm not quite sure, what the original story was. Maybe they're all legendary, but it's a great story nonetheless. But the story goes, the version I heard was that for one of the feast days in the church, in the church year, so it may have been Easter or Pentecost or something like that, that the sisters at Teresa's convent had partridge for dinner. And this would have been a very rare treat. And their monastery was not wealthy. They didn't have a lot of money. So they would have followed a vegetarian diet. It would have been a real splurge on this holy day to actually be able to eat partridge. And so the sisters go to prayer and they go to mass, and then it's time to go to the refectory for the noon meal, and they sit down and they are served the partridge, and I guess each one has their own little bird. And the story goes that as soon as the food is blessed, Teresa picks up her partridge and with gusto attacks it almost as if she had been starving, and that this was the first meal she had had in ages. And she was so aggressive against this bird she was eating that all the other sisters at the table were stunned. And they all just, none of them ate. They all just kind of watched their abbess, their mother superior, just go with gusto at this partridge. Finally, she realizes what's going on. She stops, she looks at them all. And I think one of them makes a comment like, Mother Superior, you were so aggressive with your partridge. And it is said that she replied, Sisters, when I pray, I pray. When I eat partridge, I eat partridge. So she certainly had this sense that you needed to enjoy life with gusto. You will sometimes see icons, especially more contemporary icons, depicting her holding a tambourine or even holding castanets. And the story is that on days of celebration or days of feasting, that Teresa, this very serious, saintly, mystical woman, loved nothing more than music and dancing and even performing herself with percussion. So any image you might have of her as being kind of some dour saint, try to replace that with this image of this nun joyfully dancing with her castanets and her tambourine, making a joyful act of worship to the God she adored. It is said that she would counsel her sisters, especially if they were exhausted or if they were stressed out, she would counsel them to go and take a warm bath. So she clearly understood that as important as pious activities such as prayer or fasting or Lectio Divina or any of the normal kind of churchy activities might be in religious life, that there's nothing like just taking a good warm bath to soothe a tired body. And she was not above recommending that to the women in her community. And then finally, my favorite Teresa story. I mentioned a few minutes ago that in her lifetime, she actually established 14 different monasteries or convents, which meant, of course, that she lived a very active life, especially for being a cloistered nun. And she traveled extensively throughout Spain. And so, of course, this is the 1500s. So she would travel in a stagecoach, horse-drawn stagecoach. And the story goes that one day she was out traveling between communities on a dirt road, of course, and coming to a point where there had been a rainstorm and there was mud in the road. And the wheel of the coach gets mired in the mud, and the horses cannot pull the coach out. And so Teresa and whoever her travel companions, they all have to get out of the coach. They're standing there while the men who are driving the coach are trying to get the coach out of the mud. And the story that I heard, the wheel actually falls off the axle. And at that point, Teresa is reputed to have said, she began to pray, and she said, "Dear Lord, if this is how you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few." This is how you treat your friends. No wonder you have so few. So while we read her and we see her express this kind of, almost this kind of deference towards the God who she continually describes using, kind of traditional language of Lord and King, we know that she herself had this very intimate relationship of God as her beloved, even to the point that she was willing to fuss at him a little if she was angry, as she did that one day. So Teresa has left us several major and a number of minor works. The Carmelites down in Washington, D.C. have published a wonderful modern edition of her writings. I'll talk about that when I get to the recommended readings page. But they fill up 3 volumes, not counting her letters. So her corpus of writings that she's left behind is quite large. But we're going to focus really on just 3 major books. The first one, written in the year 1567, is her autobiography. It's called The Book of Her Life. And the story goes that Teresa was having really kind of extraordinary experiences during her prayer, experiences of intimacy with God, of a sense of divine presence, a sense of God directing her. And she would bring these to her spiritual director or her confessor. Sometimes it may have been the same person. And so the story goes that in 1567, remember she was born in 1515, so she's in her early 50s at this point. This is around the same time that she's really beginning the reform. One of her confessors actually encourages her, or perhaps even instructs her, to write her autobiography. This she does, basically as an act of obedience, spiritual obedience. She gives it to the confessor so that he can read it. He is then so impressed by both the literary eloquence, but also the spiritual depth of what she has written, that he then proceeds to share it, which probably, is probably a boundary issue, but we'll, from 500 years later, we'll give him a pass. But of course, what happens is that Teresa's reputation as a woman of some spiritual maturity follows. And apparently the bishop got a hold of it, some Jesuits in the community, that it really became kind of widely known, and Teresa's reputation grew as a result of that. The Way of Perfection, also written sometime in the 1560s. We're not sure how early or how late, but also written under the advice or the encouragement of her spiritual director, but specifically in response to requests that the nuns were making, that she would teach them about prayer. So The Way of Perfection really, if the book of her life is kind of her memoir, her autobiography, her statement of her faith journey. The Way of Perfection is more didactic. It's more of a teaching book about, really, I would almost call it prayer 101. It's really just the very basic instructions about how to be committed and intentional about one's own life of prayer. And then her masterpiece, The Interior Castle, written after the first 2 books, once again written at the behest of her spiritual director. This is really her most mature statement of faith, and her most coherent description of kind of the spiritual life, the journey of the soul from kind of the initial experience of being tugged into responding to the love of God, all the way into kind of the fullness of kind of this non-dual encounter with the divine. Teresa wouldn't have used that word non-dual, but that's certainly a word I think she's describing, just not using that language. And then another significant book, not as explicitly spiritual in its teaching, but still a book that many Teresa scholars love, is really the story of her work actually establishing the the monasteries of the Reform, the monasteries and convents of the Reform, and she finishes that just shortly before her own death. She also left us a number of minor writings. Let me just briefly go through those. Meditations on the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs in the Old Testament, also known as the Song of Solomon or the Canticle of Canticles, is a very beautiful love poem. We're going to talk about this again tomorrow when we get to John of the Cross. But it has been said that that is the book in the Bible that mystics and contemplatives quote from more than any other text. And I can certainly see that. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the great Cistercian mystic and doctor of the church, left behind over 80 sermons based on this one book in the Bible. Of course, it's presenting the spiritual life under the metaphor of falling in love, of marriage, of the intimacy between a husband and a wife. And so Teresa offers her meditations on that. She also left behind a series of spiritual testimonies, just again, shorter writings. The Constitution of the Carmelite Order, the reform that she helped to found. Over 400 letters, and then poetry and miscellaneous short works as well. So what does Teresa tell us in her writing? Just a few themes that we can hold in mind as we go a little bit deeper. Teresa offers an image of God that is both very grand and very majestic. God as King, Christ as Lord, but also very intimate and very homely. The divine lover, the beloved. So you'll see her talking about kind of being careful not to offend the divine majesty, but then also really opening one's heart and appreciating the intimacy that is offered from the one who loves us so much. She describes prayer as an intimate sharing between friends. So this theme of intimacy shows up again and again in her work. She writes, prayer means taking time frequently to be alone with the one who we know loves us. Just stressing solitude there. It is for you to look at God. God never takes God's eyes off you. So this idea, and we see this also in Julian of Norwich. We see it in Meister Eckhart. This theme that shows up again and again, that contemplative prayer is essentially an act of beholding, this act of loving gaze, the loving gaze on the one who perpetually gazes lovingly upon us. And of course, she's writing very much out of the Christian tradition. She stresses the importance of acknowledging the humanity of Christ. Her Christ is not just some sort of abstract deified figure, but very much the flesh and blood, the man who walked the roads of Palestine, the one who suffered and died on the cross. And she sees that Christ really represents the doorway into this kind of intimate, loving friendship with God that she not only experienced, but commends to us as well. So I want to share with you a little kind of metaphor or analogy, I'm not sure what the right word is, that Teresa offers in her autobiography about the experience of growing or maturing in prayer. And I think this is a wonderful kind of analogy that we all can probably relate to. And she compares prayer to tending a garden or to watering a garden. And so she talks about different steps that we take when we seek to water our garden. And the first thing she talks about is you have to go to the well, you have to lower the bucket into the well, you have to pull up the water, and then walk back to the garden and water the garden, and just back and forth to the well over and over again. There's a lot of effort. She really stresses how much effort prayer takes, particularly in the beginning. This idea that to really be intentional about our life of prayer, we have to make a commitment, and we really have to be willing to make effort to um, to be there. But then she says the second stage of prayer is like installing a water wheel, installing some sort of a device that, I think in our day we might say installing a pump, but installing some sort of a mechanical device to make it easier to get the water to the well. There's still effort. There's still the effort in turning the wheel, or in pumping the pump. But the idea is that as you've matured in prayer, that God's grace begins to carry you and begins to make the experience of prayer maybe a little bit less centered on your effort and more centered on the graces that you receive. This then leads to the third stage of prayer, which she describes as like digging an irrigation ditch. So actually creating a channel in which these refreshing waters can just more directly flow into the garden. It becomes even easier. There's still effort involved. Obviously, you have to dig the ditch, you have to maintain the ditch, but it seems that with less and less effort, there's more and more grace flowing in the experience of prayer. And then finally, she says that the ultimate end to which we should all aspire is the prayer that simply is like rain gently falling on the garden. At this point, there's really no effort on the part of the human prayer. The effort, the work, the heavy lifting is all on God's part. And prayer literally becomes almost entirely an activity of reception, this just joyful willingness to receive the grace, the love, the splendor of the prayer experience. So this it's an extended metaphor. It runs over, I think, 10 or 15 pages in her autobiography. So if you're interested in that, her autobiography is the book to read. This picture here, this is a modern day picture of Avila in Spain. Obviously, you see the highway with the cars on it, but you also notice the turrets. Avila is a walled city. I've never been there. It's certainly on my bucket list, but it's said to be just an absolutely gorgeous, absolutely beautiful um, uh, medieval structure that is still there, and would give us a sense of what the city looked like when Teresa was alive, and John of the Cross as well. John of the Cross wasn't from Avila, but he certainly spent part of his life there as well. So in the way of perfection, this book, which is basically a how-to on getting started in the life of prayer, Teresa suggests that there are three fundamentals that anyone who is serious about a life of prayer needs to cultivate in their life. And I think this is pretty basic stuff, but it always bears repeating. So bear with me while I repeat this. And the first key is simply love, charity or compassion, kindness, but this willingness to acknowledge that God is a God of love, that the spiritual life is essentially responding to that divine love, and that we really manifest, we really bring to fruition divine love in our lives by our willingness to love one another. That it's in loving the neighbor as oneself that we truly express the love we have for God. In addition to love, then Teresa also, and again, kind of in the mainstream spiritual tradition, offers this idea of detachment. Now, we talked yesterday about Ignatius of Loyola and his idea of indifference. I think this is really the same thing here. That this idea of holding on loosely to both life's blessings and life's challenges. That we all experience moments of joy, moments of sorrow. We experience blessings. We experience deprivations. There are losses. There are unexpected surprises. It's the nature of life. We all have things. I have a beautiful gold coin that belonged to my mother. My mother has passed away. I love that coin. Now, it isn't my mother, but it belonged to her. So, I just, to be honest, I have a bit of an attachment to that coin. And what Teresa would counsel is just remember that the love matters more than the coin. that having that sense of detachment just brings freedom into our lives so that we can be more available to truly manifest the love that really matters the most. And then finally, she could be taking a page straight out of the Benedictine tradition here, but Teresa acknowledges humility. And again, true humility, not to be confused with humiliation or low self-esteem, but humility in the sense of being kind of self-forgetful, being having this basic recognition that it's not all about me. It's not all about me. It's really, life is oriented towards the God who is love, and that the life that I am given is a gift given to me, that I am invited then to live with joy and with fullness, but also with this kind of recognition that um, it's not all about me. I think I've seen this attributed to C.S. Lewis, but I don't think he's the one who said it first. But somebody somewhere once said, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. I think that's a really nice, snappy definition of this spiritual value. So love, non-attachment, true humility. These are kind of the doorways into the life of prayer. But now let's focus on Teresa's masterpiece, The Interior Castle. Again, written in 1577. Here's what's interesting. She writes it basically over about a 5-month period, from the beginning of June to the end of November. But she actually does most of the writing in about 4 weeks' time. There's a gap between the first half of the book and the end of the book. And I can tell you, as somebody who writes, I am in awe that a book that of such not only spiritual depth, but really kind of literary elegance could have been written so quickly. And Teresa's writing, you do get a sense of her personality. She will complain about writing. She complains that she's writing because she has been asked to write. Her nuns want her to write, her confessor, her spiritual director, all of these other people want her to write. And so Teresa is being very docile and kind of cooperative. And so here she is writing, but she can't resist making a snarky comment or two. I think it's at that time when she comes back to the book after the gap, she basically says, I don't have time to go back and reread what I've written before. So if I repeat myself, and again, I'm using a modern day idiom, if I repeat myself, you'll just have to deal with it, is essentially what she's saying. So this idea that she is just, she's just writing because she knows it's a good thing. She's been asked to do it, but that's not really that's not her self-image. She doesn't think of herself as a writer. She says once or twice she would rather be spinning. She would rather be, doing her household chores than actually sitting at the desk and writing. Of course, my response would be, what a debt of gratitude we have to her because of her insight into the spiritual life. It's a quote from my favorite dangerous source of information online. But again, it's a good quote here. The Interior Castle and the Way of Perfection are practical blueprints for seekers who want to really experience prayer as mystical union with God. Teresa's exposure of how she was blessed with contemplation illuminates the Catholic, and I would argue really the Christian theologies of grace, the sacraments, humility, and love. So, of course, what this person is saying, this author on Wikipedia, is that these books really guide us into what mystical prayer is. And so, so with that in mind, let's carry on. The name of the book actually in Spanish is The Mansions. So what Teresa is doing here is she has this guiding image, and I think it came to her in a dream, this image of the human soul as a castle. And she has this beautiful description of a castle fashioned out of a single diamond. So I had this image, almost something that would have had to have been created under a microscope, like this diamond that was intricately etched to make a medieval castle. But she describes this castle as almost like, again, thinking of Avalon, the walled city, as kind of like this containing multiple houses or multiple mansions within the castle grounds. And so she's following the comment from the Gospel of John, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, or older translations will say many mansions. If there were not, would I have told you that I'm going to prepare a place for you? So Teresa is kind of riffing on this idea that in the heart of God are many, many mansions, and we are called into these mansions. But she says not all the mansions are created equal. And so what she actually does is she gives us kind of a tour guide through 7 of these mansions in the interior castle, and each one represents kind of a stage on the spiritual journey. So again, a vision she had of the castle as a diamond. One of her confessors says that she was finally convinced to write this book because of this vision that she received. So God revealed to Teresa, in Fray Diego's words, a most beautiful crystal globe made in the shape of a castle containing 7 mansions, in the 7th and innermost of which was the King of Glory in the greatest splendor, illumining and beautifying them all. The nearer one got to the center, the stronger was the light. Outside the palace limits, everything was foul, dark, and infested with toads, vipers, and other venomous creatures. This is a theme that shows up again and again in the interior castle. Teresa, basically her metaphor for human sinfulness and for attachments, disordered attachments, are reptiles and venomous creatures. So what this book does is it looks at prayer, at morality, at ethics, at repentance, and at kind of the gradual transformation of our mind and heart, our conscience, our consciousness, according to the leading of the Holy Spirit. I think it's important to say this, and we'll circle back around after we take our journey through the interior castle, that the map is not the territory. This is a poetic way of describing the soul's journey to God. It is by no means the only way, or maybe not even the best way, but it's one way. But I hope you will appreciate, even from my brief description, and if you choose to read it yourself, that it is beautiful and a poetic description of the journey. So what I'm going to do now over the next few minutes is just try to lead us through the 7 mansions. And I'm drawing from an earlier edition of the interior castle from a translator named Alison Peer, who his translations of Teresa's works were among the most celebrated. They're a little dated now, but in his edition of the interior castle, he gives this wonderful kind of concise description of the book, kind of an overview of the book, almost a Cliff Notes version, if you will. So I'm drawing very much from what he has written. The first mansion is the mansion of humility. This takes us right back to the way of perfection, this idea that humility is kind of the doorway into the spiritual life. But again, humility is not humiliation. So Teresa describes the beauty and the dignity of the human soul. We are made in the image and likeness of God. Our humility comes out of being loved as a response to love. It's not out of being how bad we are, but actually how much loved we are. To be in the first mansion is to be in a state of grace, but somebody who just is kind of maybe still very engaged with the normal pleasures and attractions of the world that we find ourselves living in. Again, Teresa's little metaphor of the venomous reptiles. You walk into the first mansion and there's all these frogs hopping around and snakes slithering around and turtles walking around. And Teresa's not trying to creep you out. She's just saying these are the attachments to worldly things that we have, even though we're in a state of grace, even though we have made this fundamental commitment to live in response to the love of God. I once heard a Carmelite Carmelite sister say, the truth is we all want God, but we also want a whole lot more. And I think that's what Teresa is referring to here. We want money, we want wealth, we want comfort, we want friendship, we want to be loved and adored, we want fame, we want applause, the various things we want. Some things maybe are healthier than others, but let's just be real. Most of us have these kinds of desires that can be good, but that also can sometimes draw us away from that fundamental desire to respond to the love of God. Many people just kind of live in this mansion. This is kind of where we live our lives. Once again, a state of grace. It's not a bad place to be, But the light from the seventh mansion is very dim in this mansion. And so it seems maybe a little drab and dreary, and those who are here may have difficulty letting go of all the pleasures from outside the castle. So we'll see each of these seven mansions has a theme and invites us into a spiritual practice. Obviously, the theme here is humility, self forgetfulness, or being down to earth. And the spiritual practice here is to really bring into our prayer a quality of self knowledge, that we can recognize our limitations, our need for grace, and also recognize that beginning to let go of those attachments is the necessary step to move forward on our journey. So our journey takes us into the second mansion, and Piers describes this as the mansion of the practice of prayer. So if the first mansion is just kind of, the kind of the basic spiritual life, the basic Christian life, if you will, the second mansion is the person who really makes a commitment to be a little bit more intentional and more serious about their prayer life. That they don't just want to go through the motions of, going to mass, going to Eucharist, living a basically good life. It's like, no, I want this to mean something to me. So out of that first mansion, we've cultivated self-knowledge, letting go, self-forgetfulness. We begin to move into the second mansion. And so here we begin to really seek out things and people and resources that will help us to grow spiritually. Helpful reading, going on retreats, finding a spiritual director, going to confession on a regular basis, whatever the practice may be. And it varies from person to person. But the idea is that we see prayer as a discipline and not just something we do when we're in trouble. What is it that they say? There are no atheists in foxholes. But this idea is that you don't just pray when you're late for a meeting or when you're taking a test you're not prepared for. That prayer is an ordinary and ongoing part of your life. Now, there's still plenty of reptiles wandering around. The person in the second mansion could easily find themselves lured back into the first. But with perseverance, we can become less prone to the reptiles beguiling. So the theme here is perseverance, intentionality, and commitment. And the practice that we're invited to is a dedication to regular prayer, ideally daily. A more stable practice that includes, and here's a fancy term, habitual recollection, keeping God in mind on a regular basis. What has also been called by another Carmelite, Brother Lawrence, the practice of the presence of God. And other disciplines, such as you could see in a Benedictine context, like at Holy Cross, the praying of the divine office or of Lectio Divina. Recollection, we're going to come back to that, but this is where it first kind of appears, is here in the second mansion. So as we persevere in our prayer, we move on to the third mansion, known as the mansion of exemplary life. And here the seeker truly begins to understand that grace, rather than our own efforts, is the source of our virtue and happiness. Go back to the garden. This is like it's less about the effort of pulling the water up from the well and more about the experience of the water flowing through the ditch, or being brought up through the pump or the water wheel. So we're beginning to see this shift where prayer begins to take on more of a receptive quality. We can still be distracted by the occasional reptile, but the person in the third mansion has attained a mature and admirable standard of virtue. People in the third mansion are the kind of people that other people think of as very holy or very mature in their spiritual life. Typically, they are disciplined, they are humble about themselves, their own foibles, and spontaneously committed to compassion and care of others, especially those in need. But you're still only in the third mansion. There are 4 mansions to go. So the reality is that in this mansion, there still may be kind of a limitation of our vision, that the person here may begin to have a sense there must be something more. There must be something more. And what Teresa would say is that they're being called to give themselves more fully on their spiritual journey. Sometimes at this point, progress can seem to be slow and prayer might seem arid or empty. but this is seen as a necessary preparation for the journey to come. So the theme here is surrender, this idea of really opening our heart and opening our mind to the guidance and the leading of the Spirit. And the practice is that we recognize that it is in the Spirit, in the presence of God, in the presence of divine love, that we find our true security, not in our efforts, good or bad. As we shift into the fourth mansion, which, remember, there are 7 mansions, so now we're kind of in this is the center of the journey. What we begin to find is that Teresa, her language becomes increasingly exalted and what we would think of as mystical or even supernatural. The praying people moving into the fourth and beyond mansions recognize that their prayer does not arise out of their own efforts, but actually has that quality of non-effort. It's an increasing process of yielding to the leading of the Spirit. The graces of this mansion are spiritual consolations, kind of this sense of really being able to relax into deep silence, what Teresa calls the prayer of quiet, the ability to truly be still and know God. The emotional tone moves away from the fearfulness of a servant and more toward the confident love of a beloved child. Here we have someone who is committed to frequent prayer and enjoys, again, using some traditional language, both acquired and infused contemplation. Acquired contemplation, again, that's the prayer where it feels like you're making the effort. The infused contemplation is that sense of grace that is simply being poured in, that you have no control over. But Teresa will point out that every once in a while, a little frog will come wandering by. Just a reminder that we can still kind of get lost in kind of earthly attachments that may get in the way of our spiritual journey. So the theme here, again, following that we mentioned this earlier, this idea of recollection, this idea of deeply attending to the divine silence within. And the practice here is really a practice of patience and of waiting, of learning to wait on God, for only God is in charge. Bringing us now to the fifth mansion, here we recognize that nothing less than complete union with the divine will satisfy our deepest longings. And here Teresa introduces probably her most celebrated metaphor, and that's the metaphor of the silkworm. If you're familiar with that wonderful book that came out about 50 years ago called Hope for the Flowers by Trina Paulus, she's pulling straight out of Teresa of Ávila. This idea that as the silkworm goes into the cocoon, it's that experience of dying to self to rise to the new life of the beautiful butterfly. At this maturing stage in the life of prayer, we can experience the faculty even of our soul sleeping during prayer. There's kind of this quality of self-forgetfulness. Teresa says this may only be, we may only have glimpses of this, but this idea that our prayer becomes so deep that we aren't even consciously aware of what's going on. The theme here is union. Now notice we're only in the fifth of 7 mansions, but already the theme is union. And the practice is really to increasingly yield ourselves to the will of God, a deepening commitment to silence, to solitude, and to recognize that there is this traditional language of dying to the self in order to rise to new life in the divine. Now we come to the 6th mansion, and I'm going to be very honest, I have no sense that I've gotten this far on my journey, so I'm really just sharing with you what Teresa tells us. If the 5th mansion is the mansion of union, the 6th mansion is the mansion of betrothal. Like any engaged couple, in this mansion, the seeker enjoys increasing time in the presence of the beloved. The prayer of silent, loving gaze continues. There's a sense of deepening intimacy. Teresa suggests at this point we can really have trials or afflictions. She says they're not sent to test us, but they're opportunities to express just how deep our love has grown. But she'll also say this is the place where we might experience favors from God, extraordinary spiritual experiences, or ecstasies, which I misspelled, but you can correct that in your mind. Like nearly all Orthodox mystics, Teresa downplays the importance of supernatural phenomena. She emphasizes that's the relationship with God that matters, not the fireworks that might accompany it. So afflictions, what could be examples of afflictions? Being misunderstood by others, being lied about or persecuted, being burdened by overzealous or incompetent spiritual guidance. Ay, 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 ay. But on the other hand, even undeserved praise or flattery in Teresa's mind is an affliction. Why is that an affliction? Because it can pull us off course. It can throw us off our game when, of course, our desire is that deepening intimacy with the divine. She also talks about things such as scrupulosity, doubt, fearfulness, anxiety, kind of spiritual torpor, this kind of anything within us that can impede us from joyfully receiving divine love. So she says that these are painful experiences, as painful as the torments of hell. What do we turn to for relief? She says the only relief is to move even deeper into the intimacy of divine love, which of course means to move into the seventh mansion. The theme here, of course, is betrothal, preparation for the ultimate gift, and the practice. Now here, and I think I mentioned this yesterday, a lot of people have this idea that mysticism is about extraordinary or supernatural psychic experiences. And Teresa acknowledges that sometimes this kind of thing can happen. But she says that, don't make that a goal. Don't put too much importance upon that. That the practice really at this point is simply to continue with what you've already learned, to be humble, to contemplate or behold Christ with a loving gaze. Finally, we move into the seventh mansion. Here is where our Lord lives and dwells. We receive the gift of seeing our beloved face to face. In the words of E. Allison Pierce, here at last the soul reaches the spiritual marriage. Here dwells the King. It may be called another heaven. The two lighted candles join and become one. The falling rain becomes merged in the river. There is complete transformation, ineffable and perfect peace. No higher state is conceivable save that of the beatific vision in the life to come. Reminds me of the wonderful quote from Meister Eckhart, the German Dominican mystic: "The eye with which I see God is the same eye with which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one sight, one knowledge, and one love." So, of course, the theme here is marriage, but we might even use this word non-duality, which is kind of a borrowed word from the East, from Eastern philosophy. But again, that idea of the rain merging with the river, the two candles becoming one flame. And the practice here, really the practice is to simply keep on keeping on. That you could say that this is the stage in which we realize that Mary and Martha are not two. That we all have a Mary and Martha dimension in us, a dimension of prayer oriented towards the love of God and of service or action oriented towards the love of neighbor. Love of God and love of neighbor become one love. All of life's acts are a single response to that love. So once again, I'm conscious of time, so let me just kind of quickly move through, because I want to introduce you a little bit to the prayer of recollection. But just a quick story here from Thomas Merton, and I forget who tells this story, but it's somebody who's written several books. It could be James Finley, but I'm not sure, so don't quote me on that. But somebody who once was a novice under Thomas Merton went in and basically was interviewing with Merton and said, "I think I've made it to the fifth mansion, the fifth of Teresa's seven mansions." Merton apparently told this novice, "Well, here inside the monastery, nobody cares what mansion you're in. And frankly, I'd be surprised if you've made it past the second." So, kind of a snarky response. But the point is that for most of us, for us mere mortals, really the first four mansions are where we probably live our spiritual life. So that first mansion of humility, of repentance, of self-forgetfulness, that second mansion of perseverance, learning to be committed to prayer, to being committed to the spiritual life. The Benedictine ideal of conversatio morum, ongoing fidelity to spiritual life. Then this quality of surrender, of self-giving, of trust, growing in trust. And then finally, this idea of recollection, of moving into silence, into waiting, into mindfulness, attentiveness, and beholding. This is really all the spiritual guidance that most of us need to get us through a lifetime of spiritual practice. So I'd like to offer just kind of 4 affirmations that we can reflect on for our own prayer practice. Humility. May I forget myself in the vast ocean of God's love. Perseverance. May I continue to respond to God's love through all my days. Surrender. May I lay down my defenses. May I be still and know God is God. And finally, recollection. May I find peace, strength, and stability in God's silent presence. So just a few quotes from Teresa, again, just to give you a taste of her amazing personality. The important thing is not to think much, but to love much. And so do that which best stirs you to love. Oh God, help me how a soul suffers when she loses the freedom to be who she truly is. From The Way of Perfection, beautiful line here. We have heaven within ourselves, since the Lord of heaven is there. God is in our heart. The Holy Spirit has been poured into our hearts. Therefore, just basic logic, heaven is already in our hearts. Here's an interesting line, especially for dealing with difficult people in life. She says, I fear those who fear the devil more than I fear the devil himself. I fear those who fear the devil more than I fear the devil himself. Contemplative prayer, nothing else than a close sharing between friends. It means taking time frequently to be alone with him who we know loves us. And then finally, this prayer that was written on her bookmark. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God only is changeless. Patience gains all things. Who has God wants nothing. God alone suffices. So let me finish by inviting you to a very brief experience of the prayer of recollection. And this comes from a brochure that is put out by the Carmelites in Washington, D.C. And you can, I think it's Institute for Carmelite Studies. You can find them on the web. And it's just a simple, little four panel brochure that you can get from them. I think you can even download it online as a PDF. But the invitation, and we'll let this be our closing prayer. The invitation is to simply find a place and sit comfortably, to close your eyes. If you've been staring at this computer screen for an hour, give your eyes a break. And take a few deep breaths. Just allow yourself to relax, with the understanding that even this experience of relaxation is itself a prayer. It's a way of letting go in the divine presence. And notice whatever is happening inside yourself in terms of thoughts or feelings, daydreams, images, imagination, things you're worrying about, preoccupations. Notice them, but let them go. Allow your mind to relax like your body is relaxing. And then Teresa invites us to recall that we are in the divine presence. Recall that Christ is in your heart. So quietly sit with this divine presence with you right here and right now. And then she invites you to Notice if you have any desire to speak to Christ. Perhaps you just want to sit in silence. Perhaps you have a sense of Christ wanting to say something to you. Just in the quiet of your own mind and heart, allow that divine presence to interact with you. If you do not feel moved to speak or to listen to Christ, simply remain quietly. But in your mind's eye, gaze upon Christ with faith and love. Come to him just as you are. If you are joyful, you might see the risen Christ. If you are in pain, you might see the suffering Christ. But no matter where you are in your journey, you can find Christ looking at you with love and understanding. If you find your mind wandering, just like in centering prayer or any other spiritual practice, simply notice and then return to the object of your attention, in this case, to that sense of Christ within. Just allow the eyes of faith and love to gaze upon the one who is gazing on you. And let your heart express whatever love or desire you wish to share with the one who created you and who loves you and who keeps you. Now, if we were actually at the monastery, I would encourage us to do this for a lengthy period, 20 or even 30 minutes, maybe bringing in a gospel passage. I hope you can see the similarities between Teresa's prayer of recollection and St. Ignatius of Loyola's imaginative prayer. They're really so very, very similar. But in both cases, the idea is that we acknowledge that we are created in the image of God and that we carry the presence of God in our hearts. So our hearts are an appropriate place to bring our prayer and to meet the one who loves us. So that's Teresa, and that's a little bit about her prayer. So what I suggested, first of all, for reading Teresa herself, the classic translation was Alison Pierce, but those are dated now. So if you want to read probably the most scholarly contemporary English translation are the ones by Kavanaugh and Rodriguez. They are both Discalced Carmelites, published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies. The works of Teresa, not including her letters, but are published in 3 volumes. You notice in the slide I put the Collected Works Volume 2. That includes the Interior Castle on the Way of Perfection in 1 volume. So it's a handy book to have. Volume 1 is her autobiography. Volume 3 is the Book of the Foundations. And then, of course, several of her shorter works are woven in there as well. But I especially love Mirabai Starr's translation. She's translated both the autobiography, the Book of My Life, but then also the Interior Castle. She hasn't done the Way of Perfection yet. Maybe she will one day. For a commentary on Teresa, Ruth Burroughs, who is a Discalced Carmelite nun, I believe she's still alive. She'd be quite elderly. She's British. She's written a number of wonderful books, but she's in this commentary on the Interior Castle and again, it's very deep because she herself is a spiritual teacher of some renown. But that's certainly one book to help to just kind of crack open the Interior Castle and the treasures within it. As far as a biography, I would suggest that you might want to look at Archbishop Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury. He wrote a biography of hers that came out about 20 years ago. So that would be a newer biography. And then Tessa Bilecki, who's a former Carmelite nun. Tessa and I are actually going to be doing an online course with spirituality and practice later this year. So Tessa's just a wonderful woman. In many ways, she's kind of a contemporary Teresa of Avila, has that same kind of vivacious spirit. But she's written a book, not so much a biography, but kind of an overview of Teresa called Holy Daring, that I would certainly encourage you to take a look at. The subtitle says it all: The Earthy Mysticism of Saint Teresa, the Wild Woman of Avila. So if you want to get a taste of a truly, what was the women who run with the wolves, I think Teresa would qualify.